Hey guys, tonight we wander back into the dusty riverlands of ancient Mesopotamia, where temple walls glow in lamplight, reeds whisper along black water, and the names Enlil and Enki drift through the warm dark like something half prayer, half memory. You stand in a world that might feel familiar in the way dreams do, with mud brick cities, star-watching priests, and stories that have survived longer than most empires ever manage. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history, some are interpretation, and some are calm, what-if imagination. Because this subject lives right on that border, where archaeology suggests one thing, later readers may suggest another, and historians debate how far the oldest stories are meant to travel. You probably won't survive this comfortably if you expect modern plumbing personal space, or a workday that ends before sunset. So emotionally prepare yourself for the grand luxury of baked clay and bureaucracy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world these late night journeys are landing. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where the land itself teaches people to think big and worry often. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, southern Mesopotamia spreads out in flat, shimmering stretches of alluvial plain, rich with silt and stubborn with danger. Most historians agree that this environment helped shape the first great cities of Sumer. The ground is fertile, yes, but only if you manage it. Water brings life, and water also brings chaos, because rivers are rarely content to behave like polite house guests. They flood, they shift, they leave, they return. And in a place like this, where the horizon feels so open that the sky seems to lean down and inspect your work, people build not just canals and levees, but explanations. That is where the gods enter. Archaeology suggests that by the 4th and 3rd millennia, BCE Sumerian city-states such as Uruk-ur, Eridu, Nippur, and Lagash are already deeply tied to temple life. Temples are not just religious spaces in the modern sense. They are economic hubs, storage centres, ceremonial stages, and symbolic engines. Grain passes through them. Labour is organised around them. Offerings gather in them. If you live here, the divine is not tucked away for weekends. It is woven into taxes, harvest walls, and weather. Honestly, the gods have better attendance than most office managers. Among the names that rise from this world, two loom especially large in later retellings: Enlil and Enki. You hear them in the rustle of copied clay tablets, in hymns, in myths, in the long inheritance of Mesopotamian religion. What's broadly accepted is that these are major deities in Sumerian tradition, though their roles shift and deepen over time. Enlil is often connected with air authority decree and the kind of command that arrives like a stormfront. Enki, known later in Akkadian as Ea, is tied to fresh water, wisdom, craft, cleverness, and the quiet solutions that slide around brute force. One stands a bit like a king's command carried on wind, the other feels like the hidden channel under the reeds. Historians still argue whether the contrast between them reflects changing theology, city rivalry, political symbolism, or simply the natural growth of myth over centuries. That uncertainty matters because it keeps your feet on the ground. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground, at least at first, is this: Enlil is especially associated with Nippur, one of the most important sacred centres in Mesopotamia. Most historians agree that Nippur held unusual religious prestige, even when political power shifted elsewhere. A ruler might dominate one city and then another, but sanctity has its own kind of gravity. To be linked with Enlil is to be linked with legitimacy, order, and the right to rule under divine notice. Archaeology suggests that temples and inscriptions repeatedly reinforce this pattern. Kings boast of honouring gods not because they are feeling poetic after a nice lunch, but because divine favour is political currency. Enki, meanwhile, is strongly associated with Eridu, often described in tradition as one of the oldest cities. The evidence we do have points to Eridu as a very ancient settlement with deep religious importance. In myth, Enki belongs to the sweet underground waters, the Abzu, a realm not of salt sea chaos but of life-giving depth. This matters in a land where irrigation is everything. Fresh water is survival, planning, engineering, and tomorrow's bread. One interpretation is that Enki reflects the practical intelligence needed to live in southern Mesopotamia at all. If Enlil can sound like a decree from above, Enki feels like the hand that sketches the canal before anyone else realises where the water should go. And already, even before later theories arrive, you can sense why these two gods remain so magnetic. They are not interchangeable. They hold tension, authority and cunning, command and craft, judgment and rescue, the sky's hard edge and the underground current's soft persistence. A careful reading might suggest that ancient listeners are not only hearing divine biography, but watching old questions about power play out in sacred form. Who really sustains a civilization? The one who rules it, or the one who knows how to keep it from collapsing? If that sounds suspiciously modern, that's because humans have always loved recasting management problems as cosmic drama. Somewhere in the distance, a priest is probably holding a tablet and thinking, yes, this is absolutely about accounting as well as destiny. Now, before the word Anunnaki starts glowing in neon over the conversation, it helps to pause. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian mythological tradition as a group of deities, though their exact roles vary by text and period. They are not one neat, unchanging category. Scholars continue to debate how these divine groups function in different compositions and whether later readers sometimes flatten a much messier picture. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient texts are layered, copied, translated, and often fragmentary, so any clean modern summary should come with a small mental cushion. Still, the names Enlil and Enki sit near the centre of many discussions because they help organise the universe of these stories. One governs with forceful dignity, one manoeuvres with subtle intelligence, and far above them, in modern imagination, floats Nibiru, a word that would eventually become attached to all kinds of grand claims. But here at the beginning, the sky is quieter. The stars are real enough. The priests really do observe them. And the myths really do matter. A fringe idea proposes that these stories preserve memories of beings from elsewhere. But this theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. For now, a more cautious explanation could be that ancient people are doing what people everywhere do when faced with fragile life and enormous sky. They are making meaning. And that may be mystery enough for one night, because what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden answer, not a single secret tucked behind every broken tablet, but a record of how The first city builders imagined intelligence, order, conflict, and creation itself. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You stand beside a canal under a dark Sumerian sky, smelling wet clay lamp smoke and cut reeds, and the old names still move across the water. Enlil, Enki, one above, one below, one commanding, one shaping. The city sleeps lightly around you as if even now it suspects the gods are still deciding what kind of world this will be. The old names linger in the air as you move closer to the thing that preserves them best, which is not marble, not gold, and definitely not some dramatic glowing crystal hidden under a pyramid for reasons known only to late-night television. It is clay, plain damp, obedient clay pressed by hand and marked with a reed stylus into tiny wedge shapes that end up carrying kings, gods, grain, counts, hymns, complaints, and the occasional reminder that bureaucracy is one of humanity's oldest hobbies. Archaeology suggests that cuneiform begins in Mesopotamia as a practical writing system tied to administration, and over time it expands into literature, ritual law, and myth. The evidence we do have points to writing as one of the great tools that allows these early cities not just to function, but to remember. That matters because without tablets, Enlil and Enki would be far dimmer figures to you now. You do not meet them directly through statues that explain themselves. You meet them through copies of copies, through broken lines, through scribes who press signs into wet clay while lamp smoke drifts above their shoulders. Most historians agree that many of the Sumerian literary and religious texts known today survive through later copies, often from schools and temple contexts, sometimes centuries after the traditions they preserve first take shape. So even at the level of documentation, the story is already layered. You are looking at old material through younger hands. That's not a flaw. It is the whole fascination. You can picture the process. A scribe sits cross-legged or hunched forward, stylus in hand, tablet balanced just so the surface is still damp enough to receive marks. The signs come one after another with practiced economy, not elegant in the modern alphabetic way perhaps, but efficient and wonderfully stubborn. Once dried or baked, the tablet becomes surprisingly durable. Paper rots, papyrus tears. Your phone dies dramatically at 9% in the exact moment you need directions. Clay, meanwhile, survives like a tiny brick with opinions. What's broadly accepted is that the names of major Mesopotamian gods appear across a wide range of textual genres. Hymns praise them. Myths narrate them. Royal inscriptions invoke them. Lexical lists preserve them. In this written world, Enlil is not just a story figure. He is embedded in the conceptual and ceremonial fabric of the civilization. Enki too appears again and again, often in contexts emphasizing wisdom, water, cleverness, and intervention. One interpretation is that the repeated written presence of these gods helps stabilize sacred authority across generations. A careful reading might suggest that tablets are doing more than recording belief. They are actively shaping it. Historians still argue whether the literary versions of these myths reflect actual popular devotion, elite theological framing, scribal school traditions, or some combination of all three. That uncertainty matters, because ancient religion is never as tidy as the summary paragraph wants it to be. A city may honour a god officially, while households tell stories differently. Priests emphasise one trait, rulers emphasise another, and scribes quietly standardise what later ages mistake for a single fixed doctrine. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts give you access to a tradition, but not always a perfect transcript of everyday belief. Even so, some patterns come through clearly. Enlil's name is consistently associated with supreme authority in many Sumerian and later Mesopotamian contexts. He appears as a god of command, decree, and cosmic weight. Enki appears as an arranger, advisor, and problem solver, often in ways that soften or complicate harsher divine decisions. If Enlil is the raised voice in the council chamber, Enki is the person in the back who already knows where the spare key is hidden. You can see why later storytellers love them. And then there is the deliciously tricky part. The tablets do not always say exactly what modern readers wish they said. A popular rumour claims that certain translations hide explosive references to advanced beings, forbidden planets, or direct accounts of extraterrestrial engineering. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because many people encounter Mesopotamian material through paraphrases, selective retellings, or writers with a dramatic relationship to nuance. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what it really shows is how tempting ancient ambiguity can be. Broken texts invite bold imaginations, the way dark hallways invite ghost stories. The mainstream picture is more careful. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian tablets are often context-specific and linguistically difficult. Sumerian itself is complex, and many texts survive in damaged condition. Akkadian translations and adaptations add another layer. Scholars continue to debate how best to interpret particular passages, and sometimes the debate turns on a single sign, a broken edge, or a grammatical ambiguity that would make a modern copy editor lie down in a dark room. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that is especially true here. Still, the written record does let you notice something important. Enlil and Enki are not random names drifting through folklore. They belong to a highly developed religious and intellectual world in which divine powers are organised, described, and repeatedly revisited. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scribal culture values preservation and transmission. Students copy older compositions. Lists organise knowledge. Ritual language repeats. This means that when you read about Enlil and Enki, you're not just hearing one campfire tale. You're entering a curated archive of cultural memory. One interpretation is that this archive preserves not only theology but politics. Enlil's prominence in certain texts may reflect the prestige of centres like Nibiru. Enki's character may preserve the authority of traditions tied to Eridu and the deep symbolism of water in the south. A more cautious explanation could be that these associations develop gradually and unevenly over time rather than descending in one complete package from the beginning. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it helps explain why divine names are never just religious labels. They can anchor cities, justify rulers, and encode values. You can imagine a student in a tablet's house practicing signs until his wrist aches copying lines that invoke divine names he barely understands yet. Outside, the city smells of mud, dung fuel, baked bread, and wet reed matting. Inside, the teacher corrects a sign with all the warmth of a disappointed hawk. Somewhere on one of these tablets, Enlil is praised with solemn grandeur. Somewhere else, Enki appears with all the sly brilliance of a god who solves problems sideways. And in each case, the clay fixes them just enough to travel forward. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not visitors from the stars, not yet, but the extraordinary fact that humans in one of the earliest urban civilizations build a system capable of making divine ideas durable. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that cuneiform tablets preserve the names and roles of these gods across centuries. The interpreted part is that the preservation itself helps shape how power and wisdom are understood. The imagined part is quieter. You stand in a dim, scribal room while the last light fades, and each wedge pressed into clay feels almost like a heartbeat, made visible as if the city is teaching mud to remember what the sky once seemed to say. And when later ages go hunting through these texts for hidden messages, lost planets, or ancient interventions, it helps to begin here with wet clay and human hands. Before cosmic speculation, there is a scribe. Before mystery theory, there is a school tablet. Before Nibiru glides into modern imagination, there is the patient fact of a civilization writing down the names of its gods, because memory in a floodplain is too important to trust to the wind. The clay memory of those names stays with you as you step out from the scribal room and back into the open air, where the world itself seems divided into realms that feel almost too neat to be accidental. Above you, wind moves across the plain with a dry, invisible authority. Below and around you, water gathers in channels, pools under reeds, seeps into fields, and hides in the deep places where life begins again after heat. What's broadly accepted is that Enlil and Enki are associated with very different domains in Mesopotamian religion. Enlil is linked with air authority and divine rule. Enki is tied to fresh water, wisdom craft, and cunning intelligence. One stands in the elevated space of decree, the other waits in the cool depth where solutions are made. Archaeology suggests that these associations are not random poetic flourishes added later just because somebody thought contrast makes good storytelling, though. To be fair, contrast absolutely does make good storytelling. The evidence we do have points to a deeply symbolic religious world in which natural forces, social structures, and sacred power overlap constantly. In Sumer, air is not just weather, water is not just water. These are life conditions governing realities, daily negotiations. If you are trying to understand how people imagine the cosmos, you start with what can save the harvest or destroy it by next week. Enlil's sphere feels expansive and elevated. In many texts he appears as a force of command, a giver of kingship, a god whose word can shape the order of the world. Most historians agree that Enlil becomes one of the most powerful figures in Mesopotamian theology, especially in traditions linked to Nippur. He is not merely a storm god in the narrow sense, though storm and wind imagery matter. He is closer to an organising authority, a cosmic executive presence. He has the energy of someone who does not send a memo when he can send a thunderclap. You get the impression that even silence around Enlil has posture. Enki, by contrast, works through knowledge, adaptation and resourcefulness. He belongs to the Abzu, the sweet underground waters, and to the arts of shaping planning and intervening. What's broadly accepted is that Enki is associated with wisdom and craft in ways that make him unusually flexible in myth. He is often the one who finds a way through trouble rather than flattening it outright. A careful reading might suggest that Enki represents a different kind of power, not less than Enlil's, but more hidden and more technical. If Enlil is the decree carved on the front gate, Enki is the engineer quietly making sure the gate does not fall into the canal. Historians still argue whether this divine contrast reflects different phases of theology, city-based rivalry, practical environmental symbolism, or broader social tensions inside Sumerian civilization. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is useful. because when you compare them, it begins to feel as though the myths are not only describing gods, they may also be thinking through competing models of order itself. Do you preserve a fragile world by command from above, or by intelligence flowing underneath it? By authority or by skill? By decree or by design? That tension would make sense in early Mesopotamia. Most historians agree that Sumerian cities depend on organised labour, irrigation systems, storehouses and administrative coordination. Nothing about this environment allows for casual neglect. You cannot shrug at canals, you cannot freestyle flood control. A more cautious explanation could be that myths about Enlil and Enki mirror the same social realities that shape actual urban life. Someone has to rule. Someone has to know how things work. If one person does, both congratulations, you have invented the ideal king. If not, you have invented divine drama. And divine drama they definitely have. In later retellings and interpretations, Enlil can come across as stern, even severe, while Enki often appears as the more sympathetic or clever figure. That pattern may be a bit too tidy if taken as a complete summary, because ancient myths are rarely interested in making anyone perfectly consistent. Still, one interpretation is that storytellers use these two figures to explore justice and mercy in tension. Enlil defends cosmic order, which can look impressive until you are the one being organised. Enki bends outcomes through wit, which can feel merciful, until you realise the universe is apparently being run by a god who solves crises like a talented uncle avoiding direct eye contact at a family meeting. You notice how naturally their domains map onto the land around you. The wind above the fields carrying heat dust and the distant promise of change. The water below, patient and essential, moving through channels people carve but never fully control. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamian life is deeply dependent on managed water systems. Irrigation is survival. Fresh water means crops, animals, bread, beer, and the basic continuation of tomorrow. So when Enki is tied to life-giving waters and technical wisdom, the symbolism feels rooted in lived reality. The evidence we do have points to a society that would understand wisdom not as abstraction, but as the ability to make a difficult landscape habitable. A fringe idea proposes that this contrast between sky-linked authority and water-linked intelligence preserves a memory of advanced beings with specialised roles, perhaps even visitors, associated with later theories about the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has appeal because the division seems so dramatic and almost archetypal. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it tells you more about the durability of the myth than about extraterrestrials. Powerful stories invite new costumes. Give a god enough centuries and somebody will eventually put him in a spacesuit. The safer historical reading is still plenty interesting. Scholars continue to debate how best to understand the symbolic depth of these gods, because the texts are layered and their meanings shift across time. There's no full consensus on how early all of these associations become, or exactly how ordinary worshippers would have interpreted them. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But what remains strong is the contrast itself. Enlil above, Enki below, one with the commanding atmosphere of divine law, one with the hidden liquidity of divine intelligence. What if the story is pointing at something else? Perhaps not a literal conflict between supernatural beings from a distant world, but a profound early attempt to map human anxieties onto the cosmos. You fear disorder, so you imagine a god of rule. You fear scarcity, so you imagine a god of deep provision. You fear foolish leadership, so you dream of wisdom with a mischievous streak. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the domain contrast in the tradition. The interpreted part is that this may echo real tensions in Sumerian life. The imagined part is simple and quiet. You stand between wind and water at dusk, and for a moment it feels as though the whole civilization is listening upward with one ear and downward with the other, waiting to hear which voice will guide the next dawn. And that may be why Enlil and Enki remain so vivid. They are not just names from a dead language. They are shapes of power that still make sense. Command and cunning, sky and depth, rule and repair. The storm at the gate and the clever hand under the floorboards. In a world built on fragile balance, both matter and the old myths know it. You keep walking through the Sumerian city with those two divine shapes still in mind, one above and one below, one commanding and one quietly solving. And soon the myths stop feeling like distant stories and start looking suspiciously like the city itself. Everywhere you turn, there is labour. Men haul baskets of earth. Women grind grain. Children carry water or chase each other, briefly, before some adult, with a face of permanent exhaustion, sends them back toward usefulness. Donkeys shuffle along narrow paths with the emotional energy of underpaid consultants. Kilns smoke. Reeds dry in bundled stacks. Mud bricks sit in rows like fresh loaves waiting for the sun to do its part. Most historians agree that Sumerian urban life depends on organised work at a scale that would be impossible without some form of central management. And archaeology suggests that temples are deeply involved in that process. This is one of the most important pieces of solid ground you can stand on tonight. The temple is not just where people pray, it is where grain is received, where offerings are arranged, where labour may be coordinated, where records are kept, where sacred and civic life lean against each other, until separating them becomes almost silly. What's broadly accepted is that in early Mesopotamian cities, religious institutions are woven into administration and economy. If you are hoping for a clean modern line between church, office, warehouse and ceremonial theatre, the ancient world politely declines your request. That helps explain why divine oversight becomes such a powerful idea. In a city where walls must be maintained, canals cleared, fields measured, rations tracked, and offerings delivered, it makes sense that the gods are imagined not as distant abstractions, but as immediate authorities. One interpretation is that myths about Enlil, Enki, and other great deities help explain why labour hierarchy and obedience matter so much. A careful reading might suggest that divine order gives human order its emotional weight. You do not simply stack bricks because the foreman says so. You stack them because the world itself, from temple to sky, is imagined as structured, watched, and judged. Historians still argue whether this is best understood as sincere religious worldview, political reinforcement, or an inseparable blend of both. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but the blend is probably the point. Ancient societies do not always divide inner belief and outer administration the way modern people like to pretend they do. If the god of order stands behind kingship, behind the temple, behind the city's central claims, then work becomes cosmically meaningful. It also becomes very hard to skip your shift without feeling that both management and heaven have noticed. And heaven, at least, in the case of Enlil, is not shy about noticing. Most historians agree that Enlil's importance is tied not only to theology, but to political legitimacy. Rulers seek approval through the sacred centres associated with him, especially Nippur. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition in which kings describe themselves as chosen, favoured, or authorised by the gods. That is not unique to Sumer, of course, but here it takes especially early and influential form. One interpretation is that Enlil embodies the sacred backing of order itself. He is the divine gravity behind institutions, the reason the city stands in more than mud and confidence. Enki fits this urban world differently. If Enlil hovers over the system as a force of order and decree, Enki belongs to the intelligence that keeps the system alive. Water has to be directed, fields have to be sustained, craft has to be taught, problems have to be solved before they turn into small catastrophes wearing respectable hats. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamian life is technically demanding in ways that would make practical wisdom deeply valuable. A more cautious explanation could be that Enki's associations with craft and water reflect the same live dependence on skilled adaptation. In other words, the city does not survive on authority alone. It also survives on someone knowing where the leak is. You see it now in the built environment. The temple platform rises above the lower city visible from a distance, asserting not just scale but viewpoint. To build upward in a floodplain is already a statement. To build upward for a god is a statement with ceremony attached. Most historians agree that monumental architecture in Mesopotamia signals both communal effort and elite coordination. These structures do not appear because a handful of villagers had a productive weekend. They require planning, surplus labour management, and strong ideological motivation. What's broadly accepted is that temples help anchor the identity of the city itself. You belong not only to a place, but to a place under a divine patron. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if divine oversight is also the ancient answer to one of humanity's oldest urban questions, which is how on earth you persuade thousands of people to keep doing difficult, repetitive, exhausting work without collapsing into chaos or sarcastic rebellion? The documented part is that temple-centered systems organize real economic life. The interpreted part is that myths may help make those systems intelligible and emotionally binding. The imagined part is gentler. You stand in the shade of a mud brick wall while workers pass, and every footstep sounds as though it belongs to a city being built not just for survival, but under watchful eyes no one quite escapes. A fringe idea proposes that stories of gods overseeing construction labour and social roles preserve distorted memories of advanced beings directing early civilization, perhaps connected to later Anunnaki from Nibiru theories. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no full consensus supporting that leap. The more mainstream explanation is already strong enough. Early urban people experienced large systems of coordination and imagine them through divine frameworks. When the city itself feels bigger than any one life, the gods become the language for scale. Still, the allure of the fringe idea tells you something useful. It shows how modern readers react to ancient grandeur. Massive labour projects, elevated temples, elaborate administration, and enduring myths can feel so impressive that some people instinctively reach for non-human explanations. But archaeology suggests that human societies, given enough necessity, organisation and patience, are fully capable of astonishing complexity. You do not need aliens to invent taxes. Sadly, humanity handles that achievement just fine on its own. The city around you proves the point. Kiln heat presses against your skin. Fresh mud cools your feet at the edge of a workyard. A scribe passes with a tablet tucked under one arm, looking like he has never once enjoyed a deadline. Priests climb temple steps with offerings. Labourers pause briefly for bread and beer before the day folds them back into motion. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Sumerian cities are temple-centred, stratified, and intensely organised. The interpreted part is that stories of divine oversight help explain and justify that order. The imagined part is this strange feeling that the whole city is one breathing machine, every canal and storeroom and brick course held together by a belief that someone above and someone below are both paying attention. And maybe that is the first truly urban miracle. Not that the bricks rise, bricks always rise if enough hands lift them. The miracle is that people come to believe the rising matters beyond the day's labour, that a wall is not just a wall, that a storehouse is not just a storehouse, that a city can be a sacred arrangement, a human pattern laid into mud beneath the gaze of gods. Enlil gives that pattern weight. Enki gives it intelligence, and you walking quietly through the dusk begin to see how their old rivalry may also be a partnership, because no city survives on command alone, and no city lasts on cleverness without structure. Between the storm above and the fresh water below, civilization keeps laying brick. And once you have seen the city that way, with its bricks, ledgers, canals and prayers, all leaning on one another, the word Anunnaki begins to sound less like a sudden revelation and more like part of a much older sacred vocabulary. That is important because modern conversations often arrive at this word already carrying a suitcase full of assumptions, dramatic music, and at least one extremely confident narrator pointing at the stars. The safer place to begin is the older one. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian tradition as a group of deities, though not always with one fixed role, one fixed number, or one neat cosmic job description. Archaeology suggests that the term belongs inside a long and changing religious landscape, not inside a single tidy theory. You can feel the problem immediately. Modern readers like categories that behave. Ancient mythological traditions rarely cooperate. In some texts, divine groups overlap, shift, merge, or take on functions that depend heavily on context. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion develops over centuries across different cities, languages, and political eras, so any attempt to summarize the Anunnaki in one sentence will probably leave out something important. The evidence we do have points to them as divine beings associated in various ways with the great gods and with the structure of the cosmos, but scholars continue to debate the nuances. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it matters because this is where later imagination often outruns the tablets. If you stay close to the mainstream picture, the Anunnaki belong first to myth cult and cosmic ordering. They are part of the divine assembly, part of the supernatural architecture by which Mesopotamian people imagine authority, judgment, and the layered nature of existence. One interpretation is that they function as a kind of divine court or collective presence around higher gods in certain traditions. A careful reading might suggest they help dramatize the facts that sacred power, like human power, is rarely imagined as belonging to only one figure standing alone in a spotlight. Ancient religion likes councils. It likes assemblies. It likes the sense that even the heavens have meetings, which is comforting, until you remember how most meetings go. Historians still argue whether specific references to the Anunnaki are best understood as descendants of a sky god underworld powers in some contexts, or a broader divine class whose meaning shifts across time and text. There's no full consensus because the evidence is scattered and the tradition evolves. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But the broad picture remains stable enough to walk on. These are gods within Mesopotamian religion, not originally a coded science fiction species from a lost planet. That later interpretation belongs to the modern age. And yet the modern age loves it. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not gods in the religious sense at all, but actual beings from elsewhere, often linked in popular theory to Nibiru, who came to Earth in the distant past and influenced or even engineered human civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has become incredibly influential in books, documentaries, internet lore, and the general human hobby of turning ancient ambiguity into cosmic drama. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can at least ask why it became so attractive. Part of the answer is simple. The word Anunnaki sounds ancient, important, and just mysterious enough to make modern imaginations sit up straight. The texts are old, the translations are complex, the civilization is one of the earliest urban cultures in human history. Throw in damaged tablets, strange divine genealogies, and later reinterpretations, and you have perfect conditions for bold speculation. What if the story is pointing at something else? That question is powerful. It keeps people reading. It also occasionally causes them to sprint past caution, wearing sandals of pure enthusiasm. The mainstream explanation, though less flashy, is still fascinating. Archaeology suggests that the divine world of Mesopotamia is highly structured and symbolically rich. Gods are tied to cities, natural forces, kingship, fertility, wisdom, and fate. Collective divine groups make sense within that system. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki are best approached as part of this religious framework. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm is any direct ancient evidence that the Anunnaki were understood by Sumerians as extraterrestrials. That claim is modern. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient people absolutely looked to the sky, tracked celestial bodies, and imagined divine powers beyond ordinary human life. But that is not the same thing as describing space travellers in the modern sense. A more cautious explanation could be that later readers shaped by modern science fiction, space-age wonder and distrust of conventional narratives projected contemporary ideas onto ancient myths. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it explains a lot. You can almost watch the transformation happen. A difficult ancient term becomes a gateway word. A divine assembly becomes a race of visitors. Mythic authority becomes technology. Sacred descent becomes interplanetary arrival. The old temple world gets translated into a cosmic origin story because modern audiences are often more comfortable with advanced beings than with gods. It feels easier somehow to imagine engineering than holiness, easier to picture a spacecraft than a divine decree. The result is a modern myth layered on top of an ancient one. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss the whole thing with a shrug. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it speaks to a real emotional need. It offers scale, it offers mystery, it offers the thrilling possibility that humanity's oldest stories are coded records of encounters too strange for later generations to understand plainly. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is psychological. people return to the Anunnaki idea because it promises that the earliest civilizations were standing closer to ultimate answers than we are now. The older Mesopotamian view is subtler. The gods do not arrive to explain away human achievement. They exist inside the structure of the world, giving it meaning, weight, and order. Enlil and Enki are not impressive because they might secretly be astronauts. They are impressive because they embody powers that early city builders find necessary to imagine authority, wisdom, water decree, cunning legitimacy, rescue. The Anunnaki fit into that same sacred universe as part of a divine order that is already complex without needing a launch pad. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian mythological tradition as divine beings whose roles vary by text and period. The interpreted part is that their shifting function reflects the fluidity of ancient religion and political theology. The imagined part is the mood around the word itself. You stand at the edge of a temple courtyard at night, listening to distant chanting, and the term Anunnaki seems to hover above the baked brick, like a lantern in mist, bright enough to draw you forward, never quite bright enough to let you claim more than the tablets truly give. And that may be the fairest way to hold it. Not as a solved code, not as a hidden truth, but as a puzzle, a debated interpretation, a word with ancient roots and modern afterlives. The city sleeps under the stars, the reeds whisper at the canal banks, and somewhere a scribe presses another divine name into clay, unaware that thousands of years later people will still be arguing over what exactly the old gods meant when they gathered. The word hangs there after Anunnaki like a second lantern in the dark, smaller perhaps, but somehow brighter in the modern imagination. Nibiru. You can almost hear the capital letters arriving before the actual evidence does. For a lot of modern audiences, this is the moment when the old Mesopotamian world stops being a landscape of temples and tablets and turns into a cosmic puzzle board with arrows, planets, and somebody speaking in a tone that suggests the truth has finally been cornered in a parking lot. But the safer road is slower. What's broadly accepted is that the word Nibiru appears in Mesopotamian texts, especially in later Akkadian material, and that its meaning is debated. Archaeology suggests that it's connected to celestial language crossings and astronomical interpretation, not automatically to a hidden wandering planet in the modern sense. That careful distinction matters more than most people realise. The evidence we do have points to Nibiru as a term with context-dependent meanings. In some readings, it may refer to a crossing point, a place of transition, or a celestial marker associated with a particular star planet or astronomical position. Scholars continue to debate the exact applications in different texts because ancient astronomy, like ancient religion, does not arrive in a single convenient chart labelled for your comfort. Historians still argue whether certain references are best linked to Jupiter, to a crossing point in the sky, or to a broader symbolic function within Mesopotamian celestial thought. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it already tells you something important. Nibiru belongs first to the world of ancient skywatching, not to modern disaster mythology. And ancient Mesopotamia absolutely watches the sky. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilizations, especially in later periods, developed sophisticated traditions of observing celestial patterns. The night sky matters for ritual kingship omens and calendar making. Priests and scholars track movements above, not because they are casually stargazing for aesthetic reasons, though the stars are lovely, but because heavenly motion is understood as meaningful. The sky is not empty, It is legible if you have the training. It's also slightly terrifying because once you decide the universe is sending messages, every unusual event starts feeling like divine email, and nobody knows how many unread messages are piling up. One interpretation is that Nibiru functions in this tradition as a marker of crossing a point where something significant aligns or passes. A careful reading might suggest that the term is more fluid than later popular treatments allow. Instead of naming one secret planet with a fixed biography, it may refer to a role in the sky, a celestial position, or an object identified differently depending on the text. If that feels less dramatic than the modern version, yes, but only slightly. Even a crossing point in the heavens carries symbolic weight in a civilization that ties cosmic order to earthly meaning. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the later obsession with Nibiru grows precisely because the older meaning is elusive enough to invite modern projection? The documented part is that the term exists in Mesopotamian texts. The interpreted part is that it probably belongs to a complex astronomical and symbolic vocabulary. The imagined part is the sensation of standing on a temple roof at night, the plain dark below you, the stars wheeling above, while one word on a clay tablet seems to shimmer with more possibilities than the scribe ever intended. A fringe idea proposes that Nibiru is a real undiscovered or returning planet associated with the Anunnaki, sometimes imagined as the distant homeworld of advanced beings who supposedly visited Earth in prehistory. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has become one of the most famous examples of modern myth built on ancient material. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask what keeps it alive. Partly it is scale. A hidden planet is irresistible. It turns a difficult philological problem into a grand narrative. It lets modern readers imagine that the old texts are not just symbolic or religious, but technically descriptive in a way scholars somehow missed. The mainstream response is more restrained and, frankly, more believable. Most historians agree that there is no full scholarly consensus supporting the idea that Mesopotamian texts describe Nibiru as a rogue planet full of godlike beings. The evidence is thin for that leap. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient word is real. The modern planetary storyline is a debated interpretation built far beyond what the surviving texts securely allow. This raises the possibility that many popular versions of Nibiru tell you more about contemporary fascination with hidden knowledge than about Sumerian or Babylonian belief itself. That said, the older astronomical context is hardly dull. Mesopotamian thinkers treat the heavens as ordered, meaningful, and deeply connected to earthly life. The evidence we do have points to a worldview in which celestial motion matters politically and spiritually. If a certain star or planet marks a crossing, a station, or a significant moment that carries interpretive weight. A more cautious explanation could be that Nibiru becomes compelling not because it names an alien homeland, but because it sits at the meeting point of observation and symbolism. It is where astronomy leans into sacred imagination without ceasing to be observation. And you can see how that would happen. The sky over Mesopotamia is enormous. On clear nights, it would feel almost architectural, as if the darkness itself had been laid out with careful joints. Priests climb high places. They watch. They compare. They remember. They record. Somewhere down below, a city sleeps with one ear open for flood, wind, and decree. Somewhere above, a bright body crosses a known path, and a scholar notes it with all the seriousness of a person who suspects the heavens are not making small talk. No wonder later ages look back and feel tempted to inflate every celestial reference into a cosmic secret. A popular rumour claims that ancient priests preserved direct knowledge of a lost planetary cycle, something too dangerous or profound to survive openly into later history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because damaged texts and specialised terminology create empty spaces the imagination loves to furnish. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in the case of Nibiru, what we cannot confirm is just as important as what we can. We can confirm the term. We can confirm celestial contexts. We cannot securely confirm the whole modern planet of the Anunnaki storyline. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the ancient textual presence of Nibiru in a celestial framework. The interpreted part is that it may refer to a crossing point or specific astronomical role rather than a hidden world. The imagined part is softer. You stand beneath the night over Mesopotamia, and the stars look close enough to name, yet far enough to keep every answer out of reach. Nibiru becomes not a proven destination, but a symbol of that feeling, the sense that the sky contains order you can glimpse and maybe never fully own. And perhaps that is why the word endures. It sits right at the seam between solid scholarship and modern longing. It is ancient enough to feel authoritative, uncertain enough to feel open, and celestial enough to attract every theory from cautious astronomy to full cosmic opera. But for now, the safer path holds. Before Nibiru becomes a modern planet in somebody's graphic animation, it is an old word under an old sky, written by people who already knew the heavens mattered, even if they did not mean what later readers hoped they meant. And once the sky has been given its crossing points and the gods their proper stations, the story turns downward again, back to the mud and breath and labour of human life, which is where Mesopotamian myth becomes uncomfortably relatable. Because when humanity enters these old stories, it does not always arrive to applause, fireworks, or a cheerful banner reading "Welcome to Consciousness." Most historians agree that in several Mesopotamian creation traditions, human beings are fashioned in order to work, serve and maintain the divine order in practical ways. That is the broadly accepted anchor. And yes, it means the ancient answer to why you exist may sound suspiciously like a cosmic staffing decision. The evidence we do have points to this idea most clearly in texts from Mesopotamian tradition, in which humanity is created after tension among the gods, especially around labour and burden. The details vary across texts and periods, and scholars continue to debate how these traditions relate to one another. But the central pattern is hard to miss. Humans appear as useful beings shaped to take over tasks, sustain temples, provide offerings, and keep the machinery of civilization moving. If you were hoping the oldest myths would say humanity was created to pursue inner peace and artisanal hobbies, ancient Mesopotamia would like a polite word. One interpretation is that these stories reflect the social realities of temple-centered urban life. A careful reading might suggest that creation myths are doing ideological work as well as religious work. In other words, they may not simply answer where humans came from. They may also explain why labour duty hierarchy and service feel built into the structure of the world. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and later Mesopotamian society depends on coordinated effort, surplus management ritual, maintenance, and agricultural discipline. A more cautious explanation could be that myths of human creation mirror this reality back to the people living inside it. Historians still argue whether these stories should be read mainly as theological explanation, social reflection, ritual, symbolism, or some blend of all three. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but the blend is probably where the power lives. Because when a civilization says people were made to work for higher beings, it is not just offering a cosmic origin. It is placing ordinary effort inside sacred order. Grinding grain, clearing canals, carrying offerings, moulding bricks, counting jars of barley, all of that begins to look less like drudgery and more like participation in a divine arrangement. Slightly exhausting, yes. Spiritually flattering, perhaps. Convenient for institutions, absolutely. And this is where Enlil and Enki become especially interesting, because human creation in Mesopotamian tradition does not sit cleanly with just one divine personality. Enlil, tied to order, decree, and cosmic authority, belongs naturally to a world where humanity has a role within a larger structure. Enki, tied to wisdom, craft, and intervention, often appears in stories as the god who knows how life can be shaped, adjusted, or preserved. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian myths frequently cast Enki as a key problem solver in moments of creation and crisis. One interpretation is that Enki's intelligence makes him the divine figure, best suited to the messy practicalities of making humans at all. That matters because these stories are not polished philosophical essays. They are lively, uneven, and full of divine personalities, acting like beings, with both immense power and oddly familiar frustrations. In some traditions, the gods themselves grow weary of labour. The divine world is not always presented as serene perfection. It can be administrative, tense, and downright moody. That may sound irreverent, but it is actually one of the reasons these myths feel alive. The cosmos has a workload. The gods respond. Humanity enters as the workaround. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a literal assembly line of engineered beings, at least not in the mainstream reading, but an ancient recognition that civilization only exists because somebody is always doing the work no one wants to do. The documented part is that creation stories often connect humans with service and labour. The interpreted part is that this reflects the realities of early urban society. The imagined part is the quiet moment before the first human figure in myth opens its eyes as if the whole city has paused to ask whether consciousness itself may have started under a job description. A fringe idea proposes that these creation stories preserve a distant memory of advanced beings designing humans for practical purposes, often linked in modern theory to the Anunnaki and Nibiru. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the language of making shaping and assigning function can sound uncannily modern when pulled out of its mythic setting. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still tells you something useful about the old stories. They are intensely interested in purpose. Humans are not accidental in these myths. They are made with intention, even if the intention is not especially flattering. The more cautious explanation is stronger. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion develops inside real systems of labour, ritual obligation, and social hierarchy. The evidence we do have points to temple economies, organised agriculture, and elite-sponsored theology. In that context, a myth about humans created to support divine order makes perfect sense. It naturalizes the system. It sacralizes the workload. It gives suffering and repetition a place in the structure of things. It also lets the elite sleep better, which is a perk every age seems determined to preserve. Still, the myths are not cold. That is important. Even in traditions where humanity is created for service, There remains a strange dignity in being shaped by divine attention at all. Enki especially introduces a note of complexity. He is not merely a technician. He is often clever, compassionate in his own sideways manner, and willing to intervene when harsher outcomes loom. So even if the first purpose of humankind is labour, the stories do not always leave people trapped in pure function. They leave room for cunning mercy and rescue. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is one of the reasons Enki remains so beloved in later retellings. He feels like the god who knows the system is necessary and still sneaks you a better outcome when he can. A popular rumour claims that the created for labour motif is direct evidence that ancient people remembered being engineered by superior beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The ancient texts are religious literature, not laboratory notes. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can confirm is already substantial. Mesopotamian myths imagine human beings as necessary participants in the upkeep of order, and that vision fits the world that produced the myths. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that humanity's role in these traditions is closely linked to labour and service. The interpreted part is that this may reflect temple society rather than literal biological origins. The imagined part is softer and stranger. You stand at the edge of a canal at dawn feet in cool silt, while smoke rises from the first ovens and birds stir in the reeds. And for a moment it feels as though the first human story was never about grandeur at all, but about being handed a world already in motion and told, with ancient understatement, please keep this running. And maybe that is why the story lasts. It is not flattering exactly, but it is honest in a way civilizations often are. Work matters. Order needs hands. Life in the floodplain is too fragile for idleness. So the gods make people, and people inherit the fields, the walls, the altars, the ledgers, and the endless quiet expectation that the world must be maintained. Enlil gives that expectation its force. Enki gives it its technique. And you, like every human in every era, are left standing between duty and invention, trying to look useful before the sun gets too high. The sun is higher now, and the canal edge under your feet has turned from cool dawn softness to that tacky practical mud that clings to sandals and quietly reminds you that all great civilization begins with materials no one would call glamorous: clay on the hands, silt between the toes, damp reeds stacked in bundles, a city rising from what looks at first glance like an argument between water and dirt. Archaeology suggests that the riverlands of southern Mesopotamia shape not only daily survival, but also the symbolic language of myth, and that matters deeply once creation stories begin describing humans as formed from earthly substance. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian traditions often imagine the making of human beings through materials drawn from the land itself, especially clay, mud, or earth-like matter. That is not a side detail. That is the emotional centre of the image. You can see why. It's a place where houses are made from mud, brick tablets are written in clay, canals are carved through silt, and fields depend on the gifts and moods of the river. The earth is not passive background. It is the medium of life. A careful reading might suggest that creation from clay is less about primitive science and more about intimate dependence. Humans are made from the same stuff they build, with, record with, and farm on. One interpretation is that this symbolism ties the body directly to the landscape, as if the land itself is not merely where people live, but what people are. Most historians agree that such imagery fits a world in which material life is overwhelmingly shaped by the river plain. The evidence we do have points to a civilization whose practical reality is inseparable from clay. Walls, ovens, storage jars, figurines, tablets, drainage features, house platforms, everything seems to carry the touch of mud transformed by labour. So when myth imagines the human body formed from earth, the metaphor would likely feel obvious rather than poetic in some grand abstract sense. It would feel local, familiar, almost too ordinary to need explanation. Of course, people come from clay. Look around. Everything else does too. Historians still argue whether the earthly substance in these creation stories should be read symbolically, ritually, materially, or all at once. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but the overlap is probably the point. Ancient myth rarely asks you to choose one layer. Clay can be literal material in the story, symbolic material in theology, and social material in lived experience all at the same time. If the evidence is thin on exactly how ancient listeners processed every nuance, will say so, but the core association is strong enough to trust. Humans belong to the same world they are trying to survive in, and that makes the creation image feel less triumphant and more humble. Not stars, not gold, not polished stone, mud. Beautiful, useful, inconvenient mud. The sort of substance that dries too fast if you ignore it and collapses if you mistreat it. There is something wonderfully unsentimental about that. Humanity is imagined not as imported perfection, but as shaped, earth, fragile and workable. If you wanted a myth that flatters the species a little more aggressively, ancient Mesopotamia once again invites you to lower your expectations and fetch another basket. Enki's presence hovers naturally here. What's broadly accepted is that Enki is linked with fresh watercraft and the hidden deep called the Abzu. That makes him especially fitting in traditions where life emerges through the mixing of substance, skill and vital force. A more cautious explanation could be that Enki's role in creation reflects his broader association with making things function, arranging difficult realities, and bringing form out of raw potential. In a land where wet clay becomes tablet brick, seal, or wall, through knowledgeable handling, Enki's wisdom feels almost tactile. He is the divine intelligence of proper shaping. Enlil, by contrast, belongs more to the order into which the shaped being enters. One interpretation is that if clay explains what humans are made from, Enlil explains what they are made for. Order, work, place, duty, decree. The body comes from earth, but its role is assigned under heaven. That is not stated in exactly those tidy terms in every text, of course, but it captures the tension well enough. Enki helps form. Enlil helps frame. One gives workable substance a chance to become life. The other places that life into a structured cosmos that does not especially care if you wanted a slower morning. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if creation from mud is not only about origin, but about relationship? The documented part is that Mesopotamian myths use earth-like material in human formation. The interpreted part is that this may symbolize dependence on land labor and the material world of the floodplain. The imagined part is quieter. You kneel beside a reed basket full of wet clay, and for a moment it feels as though the first human form in the story is not being manufactured, but coaxed lifted gently out of the same riverbank that will one day feed and bury everyone. A fringe idea proposes that references to crafted human formation preserve a memory of biological engineering by advanced beings, often tied in modern theory to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the language of shaping and design sounds tantalizing when filtered through modern technological imagination. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what does it actually give us? Mostly a change of costume. The deeper pattern stays the same. Human beings are not accidental. They are made with intention out of matter already present in the world. The mainstream reading simply keeps that process inside mythic symbolism rather than turning it into ancient laboratory procedure. And the symbolic reading has real power. Archaeology suggests that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian life is materially intimate in a way modern industrial life often is not. You touch the stuff of survival constantly. You know the behaviour of mud after rain of brick under heat of water when the channel walls fail. The evidence we do have points to a society whose imagination would naturally see no hard border between material and meaning. Clay is not boring matter waiting for philosophy to happen. Clay is already part of philosophy, already part of religion, already part of memory, already part of you. A popular rumour claims that ancient myths about moulding humanity contain hidden technical instructions misunderstood by later generations. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The ancient texts are evocative, not technical manuals. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can confirm is striking enough. Mesopotamian myth ties human identity to the land in the most direct possible way. You are made from the same environment you must learn to manage, obey, and endure. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the clay and earth imagery of human creation. The interpreted part is that this likely reflects the riverland ecology and symbolic world of Mesopotamia. The imagined part is the softness of the scene itself. Your hands are coated in wet brown earth. A breeze moves over the reeds. Distant voices carry from the temple yard, and it feels for a moment as though the line between soil and skin is not a barrier at all, but a brief agreement. And perhaps that is the point the myth never quite stops making. Human beings are shaped not separate, made not dropped in from nowhere, bound to the river plain to the labour it demands, to the buildings it allows, to the records it preserves. The first body rises from mud and enters a world of wind, water, order and work. Enki understands the shaping. Enlil understands the structure waiting beyond it. And you standing ankle deep in the same earth begin to sense why the old stories never needed marble to feel profound. They already had clay, which is far more honest. And once human beings have been shaped from the stuff of the river plain, the old stories do what river civilizations so often do sooner or later. They flood. Not politely, not symbolically in some vague poetic drizzle, but with the full force of water as memory threat and cosmic correction. What's broadly accepted is that flood traditions run deeply through Mesopotamian literature, and archaeology suggests that life in the alluvial south would make destructive inundation an entirely believable feature of both experience and imagination. You do not need to invent the terror of rising water when you live in a place where the land is flat, the channels are fickle, and the line between blessing and disaster can disappear overnight. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood narratives are among the oldest substantial flood stories preserved in writing, though the traditions develop in different versions over time. The evidence we do have points to a family resemblance across stories involving divine decision, human danger, survival through warning, and the possibility that catastrophe is remembered through mythic form. A careful reading might suggest that these stories preserve not one single historical event, but a recurring truth of life in the Riverlands. Flooding happens, cities suffer, survivors remember, priests interpret, scribes write, and somewhere between memory and meaning, the story becomes larger than any one storm. This is where Enki more than ever moves into the torchlight. In Mesopotamian tradition, especially in later well-known flood narratives, Enki often appears as the god who warns, advises, or quietly subverts harsher divine plans. Enlil, by contrast, can be associated with the authority behind the decree itself, including decisions that bring destruction or reset. That broad pattern is widely recognised, though its details differ across texts and traditions. One interpretation is that the opposition between Enlil and Enki becomes especially vivid in flood stories because flood itself is the perfect setting for their deeper contrast. Enlil represents order imposed from above, even when it is severe. Enki represents cunning preservation, the intelligence that finds a side door when the front gate is locked. Historians still argue whether the flood stories should be read mainly as mythic theology, cultural memory of real river disasters, literary inheritance, or some blend of all three. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but the blend again feels right. The river plain produces both practical danger and symbolic opportunity. Water destroys, yes, but it also reveals what a culture believes about justice, mercy, warning, obedience, and survival. If the evidence is thin on tying any one tale to one exact flood, we'll say so. But archaeology suggests there were certainly episodes of flooding and environmental disruption in Mesopotamian history serious enough to leave marks on local memory. The flood in myth is never just weather. It is judgment, exhaustion, divine irritation, cosmic housekeeping, or all of those wearing the same wet cloak. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian stories, divine motives can sound unsettlingly familiar. The gods are not always serene moral philosophers. They can be frustrated, reactive, divided, and alarmingly willing to make large decisions affecting people who did not get invited to the meeting. That is part of what makes the stories feel old in the best possible way. They do not pretend the cosmos is run by a committee of perfect customer service professionals. And then there is Enki, slipping through the side of the narrative like a god with a wink and a backup plan. What's broadly accepted is that in flood traditions connected to Mesopotamian myth, a warning is given that allows survival. A more cautious explanation could be that Enki's role reflects his larger character as a patron of wisdom, craft, and adaptive intelligence. He does not always openly defy order. He bends around it. He preserves through indirection. He is the divine version of the person who follows the rules just carefully enough to find the loophole keeping everyone alive. You can imagine the scene at night. Reed walls whisper in the breeze. Water already smells wrong too, present, too restless. A sleeping household stirs. Somewhere beyond the channels are thickening and pressing against their bounds. A voice comes not in a theatrical beam of special effects, but quietly, almost privately, through wall dream instruction riddle. Build, prepare, listen, move now. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not proof of one global cataclysm, not a secret code from another planet, but the ancient recognition that survival often depends on warning received just in time and wisdom humble enough to act on it. A fringe idea proposes that flood myths preserve memories of advanced beings attempting to protect chosen humans from a large-scale catastrophe, sometimes folded into modern Anunnaki and Nibiru theories. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the narrative ingredients are irresistible. Superior beings, a coming disaster, secret knowledge, select survival. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the emotional shape still tells you more than the certainty ever could. These stories matter because they stage the most human fear of all, that the world can change faster than you can think, and your only chance is whether someone wiser warned you early enough. The mainstream reading remains plenty rich. Archaeology suggests that flood-prone environments naturally generate stories of destruction and rescue, especially in societies where water is both essential and dangerous. The evidence we do have points to a close relationship between Mesopotamian ecology and Mesopotamian imagination. A popular rumour claims that the flood stories prove a single hidden global event remembered in technical detail. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The texts are powerful, but they are not straightforward weather reports. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Still, the contrast between Enlil and Enki sharpens beautifully here. Enlil's world is one of decree structure, consequence. Enki's world is one of preservation, improvisation, mercy through craft. One interpretation is that the flood stories dramatize a permanent theological tension. Can order become too harsh? Can wisdom justify bending the rule? Can life be preserved without undermining authority? Those are not childish myth questions. Those are civilization questions, government questions, family questions, honestly office questions too, just with fewer reed boats. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that flood traditions are deeply rooted in Mesopotamian literature, and that Enki often occupies the role of warning or preserving intelligence. The interpreted part is that these stories may reflect both real environmental danger and broader reflections on divine justice and mercy. The imagined part is softer. You are in a reed boat before dawn, the air cool and tight with silence, the dark water nudging the hull, while behind you a city becomes only a blur of lamps and shadow. The world is not ending, it is changing shape, and the only sound that seems steady is the memory of a god who chose not to let the whole thing sink without a whisper. And when the water finally begins to lower in the mind of the story, what remains is not just relief, it is a deeper pattern. Humanity survives not because the cosmos is simple, but because the divine world itself contains tension. Enlil can judge, Enki can save. The flood becomes the place where both truths meet. Above decree, below hidden water, between them one fragile vessel carrying memory forward into the next age. The reed boat drifts out of the memory and leaves you standing once more on solid ground. Though solid in Mesopotamia always means something slightly negotiable, as if the land itself reserves the right to become soup under the right conditions. Still, the flood has shown you something that matters beyond catastrophe. It has shown you personality, not just divine function, not just cosmic job titles, but temperament. By now, Enlil and Enki no longer feel like abstract entries on a mythological chart. They feel like two very different minds moving through the same sacred world. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often cast major gods in contrasting roles, and with Enlil and Enki that contrast becomes especially memorable. One tends toward command structure and consequence, the other tends toward wisdom, craft, and strategic mercy. What's broadly accepted is that this contrast is not an invention of modern readers. It grows out of the myths themselves, where Enlil can appear stern, elevated and decisive, while Enki often appears clever, flexible and unexpectedly helpful. That does not mean either god is simple. Ancient deities almost never are. They are not tidy moral mascots separated into villain and hero for your convenience. A careful reading might suggest that later retellings exaggerate the contrast because it is just so narratively satisfying. Enlil has the energy of a ruler who issues policy from a high balcony. Enki has the energy of the advisor already halfway through fixing the mess before the meeting ends. Historians still argue whether this difference reflects evolving theology, literary style, city-based politics, or a deeper symbolic tension within Mesopotamian religion. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps to think of these gods as embodiments of different kinds of order. Enlil's order is vertical. It descends, it commands, it names limits and expects the world to respect them. Enki's order is lateral. It moves through channels, it adapts, it finds pathways around crisis. Both are necessary in a fragile civilization. Too much decree without flexibility and the world snaps. Too much improvisation without structure and the world dissolves into damp confusion and very poor scheduling. You can feel this in the stories. Enlil is often associated with kingship legitimacy and the weight of divine authority. Most historians agree that his cult at Nibiru makes him central to ideas of sacred rule. The evidence we do have points to a long-standing prestige attached to his name. He is the god who makes rule feel official, cosmically backed, not just locally enforced by whoever has the most armed supporters and the loudest ceremonial hat. One interpretation is that Enlil's sternness reflects the needs of urban civilization itself. Cities need hierarchy, fields need coordination, temples need predictability. Someone has to set terms. Enki, by contrast, seems to understand what happens when terms meet reality. He belongs to the wet places, the deep knowledge, the craft of making systems actually work once the decree has been issued. What's broadly accepted is that he is associated with wisdom, technical skill, and the kind of intelligence that solves problems indirectly. A more cautious explanation could be that Enki personifies the reality that no complex society survives on authority alone. Rules matter, yes, but so do canals, repairs, exceptions, and the person in the corner who knows how to stop the roof from leaking over the records room, which, to be fair, may be the single holiest service in administrative history. What if the story is pointing at something else? Perhaps these divine temperaments are also ways of thinking through human leadership. The documented part is that the myths contrast Enlil and Enki in meaningful ways. The interpreted part is that this may reflect debates within Mesopotamian culture about justice, power, mercy, and practical intelligence. The imagined part is quieter. You stand inside a temple corridor while voices echo from separate chambers, one voice carrying the hard edge of decree, the other the low patience of a plan being adjusted in real time. And it feels as though the civilization itself is learning how to argue with itself in sacred language. That may explain why later readers keep being drawn to the pair. They are dynamic. They are almost theatrical. Enlil can seem severe enough to unsettle you, while Enki often wins affection, because he behaves like the god who remembers that people are fragile and systems are messy. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That is a pattern in many readings, not a full summary of every text. Ancient myths are inconsistent in the way real traditions always are. Enki is not simply a modern nice guy in a horned crown. Enlil is not simply cosmic middle management. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the broad contrast holds strongly enough that scholars continue to debate how deliberate it is. A fringe idea proposes that Enlil and Enki preserve memory of rival factions among advanced non-human beings, with one group favouring stricter control and another favouring human development or survival. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because the myths really do lend themselves to that reading if you approach them through a modern science fiction lens. Two powerful figures, different agendas, human beings caught between them. It is very tempting material. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though what emerges most clearly is not extraterrestrial politics, but the enduring human fear that the powers shaping life may not agree among themselves. The mainstream explanation is already compelling. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion evolves in complex conversation with environment, kingship, temple, power, and literary tradition. The evidence we do have points to divine personalities that grow richer over time because they are used to think through real problems. When should judgment yield to mercy? When should order be preserved even at painful cost? When is cleverness a virtue, and when does it become subversion? Those are theological questions, yes, but also social ones, family ones, legal ones, civilization building ones. A popular rumour claims that one of these gods was secretly humanity's true benefactor while the other was its oppressor, and that ancient myths encode this conflict more plainly than scholars admit. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The ancient texts do not line up so cleanly behind a single hidden truth. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can confirm is enough. Mesopotamian stories repeatedly explore the tension between authority and wisdom through figures who remain larger than any one interpretation. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the recurring contrast in role and temperament between Enlil and Enki. The interpreted part is that this may express a deeper cultural meditation on power and care. The imagined part is simple. Evening wind moves through the city carrying kiln smoke and water scent together, and for a moment it feels as though the whole world is held between two ways of governing the command from above and the adjustment from below. And maybe that is why these gods remain so vivid even now. They are not merely names in a list. They are two answers to the same impossible question. How do you hold a human world together? Enlil answers with authority, structure, sacred weight. Enki answers with skill, flexibility, and the refusal to let disaster have the last word. Between them, ancient Mesopotamia keeps thinking aloud about rule survival, and the strange truth that even the gods, it seems, may disagree on what kind of order humans actually need. That disagreement, or at least that difference in style, does not stay floating in myth like a decorative cloud. It settles into the very real business of ruling cities, managing land collecting offerings, and convincing large groups of people that the whole arrangement makes sense. And in early Mesopotamia, making the arrangement make sense is half the job. Most historians agree that kingship in Sumer and the broader Mesopotamian world is deeply entangled with religion. Rulers do not stand apart from the divine order and politely wave at it from a distance. They present themselves as chosen, favoured, authorised, or upheld by the gods. Archaeology suggests that inscriptions, temple building, ritual, performance, and royal claims all help reinforce this bond. What's broadly accepted is that Enlil in particular becomes strongly associated with sacred legitimacy. His name carries weight far beyond one city's local cult. Nippur, his great cult centre, holds religious prestige that outlasts changing political fortunes. Kings may rise in Ur-Akkad Babylon or elsewhere, but to be recognised in relation to Enlil is to be placed within a larger sacred map of authority. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition in which rulers present themselves as operating under divine sanction, and Enlil often stands near the top of that symbolic structure. If kingship is theatre law, labour management, and prayer all rolled into one, Enlil supplies the stage lights and the official seal. You can see why this matters in a floodplain full of competing cities. A ruler needs more than troops and grain. He needs meaning. He needs the city to feel not merely powerful, but rightful. One interpretation is that Enlil embodies the sacred side of political order so effectively because he represents more than force. He represents the cosmic arrangement itself, the idea that rule is not only practical, but built into the shape of the universe. A careful reading might suggest that invoking Enlil allows kings to frame their decisions as participation in divine order rather than ambitious improvisation, which, to be fair, is a very elegant way to make your policy sound less like my idea and more like the sky and I had a conversation. Historians still argue whether this divine political linkage is best read as sincere belief, ideological strategy, or an inseparable combination of both. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but the combination again seems likely. Ancient rulers are not modern press secretaries inventing religion from scratch for convenience. They live inside the same sacred world they use. The temple, the ritual calendar, the offerings, the hymns, the processions, all of it is real to them, even as it also serves political ends. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't fully separate. Belief and power are braided together so tightly here that trying to untangle them may say more about modern habits than ancient ones. Enki fits this royal picture differently, and that difference matters. What's broadly accepted is that Enki is less the god of overt kingship than the god of wisdom craft, ordering knowledge, and the practical intelligence required for civilization to function. A more cautious explanation could be that while Enlil authorizes the throne, Enki makes the throne survivable. A city needs legitimacy, yes, but it also needs canals maintained, artisans trained, plans adjusted, and crises solved before they become royal embarrassments preserved in clay forever. Enki's sphere is the art of making complexity work. If Enlil is the charter, Enki is the operating manual, and every civilization eventually learns it needs both. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian kings often define themselves through building activity, temple restoration, irrigation works, and the maintenance of order. These are not decorative side projects. They are central to the role. Archaeology suggests that monumental construction, canal works, and sacred patronage are deeply tied to royal identity. In that light, the mythic contrast between Enlil and Enki becomes even more useful. The king must look like he embodies command from above, but he must also deliver practical prosperity below. He must be lawful and effective, impressive and useful. In other words, he must somehow be divine enough for ritual and competent enough for drainage. Leadership has rarely improved since. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the divine language around kingship is also the ancient solution to a deeply human political problem? How to persuade a population that power is not only stronger than they are, but justified. The documented part is that rulers regularly anchor themselves in sacred frameworks. The interpreted part is that Enlil especially becomes a symbol of political order and legitimacy, while Enki represents the intelligence needed to sustain real administration. The imagined part is quiet and ceremonial. You stand in a temple court as incense lifts in the warm evening air. A ruler approaches the altar under carved emblems and woven banners, and the whole scene seems designed to say that the city is not merely governed but cosmically arranged. A fringe idea proposes that ancient kingship rituals preserve memory of actual instruction from powerful non-human beings, with Enlil and Enki representing factions of advanced overseers who shape civilization directly. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals because royal ideology can sound almost too grand, too theatrical, too far-reaching. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, a more cautious explanation could be that human societies naturally exaggerate power through sacred language. The larger the state grows, the more it needs symbols big enough to hold it together. Gods, frankly, are excellent at scale, and scale is exactly what Mesopotamian kingship needs. The city is not a village anymore. There are storehouses, fields, workshops, trade walls, rival rulers, priesthoods, and ordinary people who would very much like the river not to destroy the barley supply this year. Most historians agree that divine sanction helps rulers situate themselves within all of that. The evidence we do have points to a model of rule where sacred approval is not decorative but foundational. Scholars continue to debate how different kings, cities and periods adjust this language, but the pattern is strong. Authority is never just military. It is ceremonial, theological and environmental all at once. A popular rumour claims that ancient monarchs were literally appointed by beings from another world, and that stories of divine kingship are misunderstood records of that direct contact. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The surviving record supports a religious political worldview, not a confirmed interplanetary administration. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The grandeur is real. The literal alien interpretation is debated. The old texts are powerful precisely because they make earthly government feel larger than life without needing to become science fiction. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian kingship borrows legitimacy from the gods, especially from traditions associated with Enlil. The interpreted part is that Enki's domain of wisdom and craft complements this by representing the intelligence needed to keep order functional. The imagined part is softer. Torchlight flickers against plastered walls, sandals scrape across worn temple stone, and a king pauses before a sacred threshold, as if the whole city is holding its breath, waiting for power to be blessed, before it returns to the business of canals, taxes, and tomorrow. And perhaps that is the most revealing thing of all. Kingship here is never only about ruling people, it is about mediating between heaven and earth and the difficult plane in between. Enlil gives rule its height, its sacred distance, its unignorable authority. Enki gives civilization its depth, its techniques, its hidden competence. Between them, the ruler becomes something more than a strong man with resources. He becomes a figure standing inside an old cosmic arrangement, trying to look worthy of both the storm above and the sweet water below. That ruler steps back from the sacred threshold, and the story itself begins to do something very human. It travels, not cleanly, not faithfully in every detail, and certainly not with the sort of neat preservation that modern readers dream about when they imagine the ancient world handing us a fully indexed archive. Stories move the way rivers do. They split, merge, pick up silt, lose banks, change names, and still somehow remain recognisably themselves. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian cultures, especially Akkadian and Babylonian ones, reuse, adapt, and transform older Sumerian material. Archaeology suggests that this is not a side note, but one of the central facts of the textual tradition. Enlil and Enki do not remain frozen in one pristine Sumerian moment. They continue living through translation, reinterpretation, and cultural inheritance. What's broadly accepted is that many texts known from later periods preserve older motifs even as they reshape them. Enki becomes Ea in Akkadian tradition. Sumerian mythic themes continue into broader Mesopotamian literature, with adjustments in language, theology, and emphasis. One interpretation is that this continuity gives the old gods unusual durability. A careful reading might suggest that what survives is not a perfect copy of the past, but a chain of memory in which each era gently edits what it inherits. If that sounds suspiciously like every family story ever told, yes, ancient civilizations also had a talent for passing things on with added garnish. This matters because modern readers often approach Mesopotamian mythology as though it were one unified package delivered from antiquity in sealed wrapping. It is not. The evidence we do have points to a layered tradition, with compositions copied by later scribes' old ideas reframed in new political worlds, and divine roles adjusted to fit changing religious systems. Historians still argue whether certain narratives preserve very early cores or are better understood as later literary constructions using older building blocks. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it keeps your expectations in the right place. You are not hearing one uninterrupted voice from the dawn of civilization. You are hearing an ancient choir with members joining, leaving, and occasionally changing the tune while insisting it is the same song. Enlil's prestige remains powerful through much of this process, especially in connection with sacred kingship and cosmic order. Enki, under the Akkadian name Ea, continues to shine as a god of wisdom, craft, and cunning intervention. What's broadly accepted is that these divine profiles remain influential across centuries because they answer enduring needs. Order still matters. Intelligence still matters. Water still matters. So the old figures stay useful. A more cautious explanation could be that gods survive when they continue to organize reality in ways that later societies still find meaningful. Deities like institutions tend to persist when people cannot quite imagine replacing the functions they serve. But continuity also creates temptation. A popular rumour claims that because these gods and motifs reappear across multiple ages, they must preserve some hidden historical truth too important to vanish, perhaps even a coded account of ancient contact with beings from elsewhere. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives in exactly the spaces where tradition becomes layered. The older and more complex a body of material is, the easier it becomes for modern imagination to assume that survival equals secrecy. If a story lasts for centuries, people naturally ask what secret it is protecting. The mainstream answer is simpler and in its own way richer. Stories last because they work. They explain, justify console, and fascinate. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian scribal culture is deeply invested in preserving and adapting the past. The evidence we do have points to schools, temples, and courtly settings where old texts are copied because they are prestigious, useful, sacred, or intellectually central. A careful reading might suggest that continuity across ages reflects cultural value, not hidden revelation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the old myths endure not because they are encrypted science reports, but because they remain good tools for thinking. And thinking is exactly what later ages keep doing with them, as Sumerian traditions pass into Akkadian and Babylonian frameworks. The divine world becomes both more connected and more reinterpreted. Scholars continue to debate how much continuity there is in any one case, and there's no full consensus on the exact path of every motif. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but the broad pattern is stable enough. Mesopotamian religion is not static, it is cumulative. Gods are inherited and reframed, meanings stretch, old sacred centres retain prestige even as empires change around them. It is less like preserving a fossil and more like tending a fire that gets fed with different wood. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a single hidden message travelling intact through millennia, but a more ordinary and more astonishing truth? Humans keep returning to the same great patterns because they still feel useful under new skies. The documented part is that later Mesopotamian cultures adapt older Sumerian material. The interpreted part is that this process reflects living tradition, not perfect preservation. The imagined part is quiet. You stand in a later scribal room centuries after the earliest temple songs first sounded, and the air still smells of clay dust and lamp oil, while a scribe copies an old divine name into a newer language, as though carrying a flame across a windy courtyard. A fringe idea proposes that this long transmission preserves a concealed cosmic history which priestly elites understood but deliberately encoded in mythic form. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The surviving tablets do not securely support a grand, hidden planet chronicle passed unchanged from Sumer to Babylon. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can confirm is already compelling. Later Mesopotamian civilizations took the old material seriously enough to keep recasting it, which tells you just how powerful these divine figures remained. Enlil and Enki endure because they are not bound to one moment only. Enlil continues to represent authority, sacred weight, and the legitimacy that rulers crave. Enki, or Ea, continues to represent wisdom, adaptability, and the deep intelligence needed whenever order becomes too rigid for life to fit inside it. One interpretation is that their survival across ages reflects how basic those tensions are. Civilization always needs structure. Civilization always needs flexibility. Remove either one, and things go badly, usually with paperwork first, and floodwater shortly after. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Akkadian and Babylonian traditions rework and preserve older Sumerian religious material. The interpreted part is that this continuity reflects cultural transmission rather than proof of a hidden cosmic narrative. The imagined part is the soft persistence of the old names themselves. Outside, empires rise, borders shift, languages change, kings boast and vanish. But in the quiet light of a tablet room, the stylus still presses into clay, and the ancient gods keep finding new ways to remain present. And perhaps that is the deepest form of survival, not secrecy, but reuse. Not a code nobody can solve, but a pattern nobody quite finishes outgrowing. The old myths move forward by changing shape, and in that slow transformation, they become even more human. Enlil still stands in the high place of order. Enki still waits in the deep place of knowledge. And the civilizations that come after Sumer keep borrowing both because the world continues to need a sky of authority and an underground stream of cleverness even after the first cities are long buried in dust. And after watching those old names survive across languages, empires and copied tablets, you eventually arrive at the most revealing part of the journey, which is not only what ancient Mesopotamians believed, but what modern people keep wanting from them. Because the farther you move from the original temple courts and scribal schools, the thicker the mist becomes, fragments break, context slips. A line here survives a line, there vanishes. And into those gaps, modern longing walks in, wearing very confident shoes. Archaeology suggests that the ancient texts are often damaged, partial and difficult, and most historians agree that this incompleteness is one of the main reasons Mesopotamian myths invite so many later reinventions. When the archive is broken, imagination starts furnishing the missing rooms. What's broadly accepted is that modern fascination with Enlil Enki, the Anunnaki and Nibiru says as much about contemporary desires as it does about ancient religion. A careful reading might suggest that people are not only searching these myths for history, they are searching them for scale, for meaning, for an origin story large enough to match modern feelings of uncertainty. One interpretation is that the appeal of these old figures grows stronger in eras when ordinary explanations feel emotionally insufficient. If modern life seems bureaucratic, alienating, technological, and spiritually thin, then ancient stories about powerful beings, hidden knowledge, and cosmic design begin to look less like old religion and more like lost importance. That shift is worth noticing gently because it does not make the modern fascination foolish. It makes it human. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is complex, symbolic, and deeply embedded in the social world that produced it. The evidence we do have points to temple economies, local cults, political theology, floodplain, ecology, literary transmission, and evolving divine roles. But modern readers often approach the same material from entirely different emotional needs. They may want hidden truth instead of layered tradition. They may prefer coded science over sacred myth. They may feel that if the ancients were closer to the beginning, then perhaps they stood closer to the answer. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it explains why the old texts keep being pulled into modern debates about origins, extraterrestrials, suppressed history and cosmic memory. Historians still argue whether popular reinterpretations of Mesopotamian myth should be treated mainly as misreadings, myth-making, creative reception, or a kind of modern folklore in their own right. There's no full consensus on how charitable to be, though scholars tend to be firm about the limits of the evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, a more cautious explanation could be that every era remakes the ancient world in its own image. The 19th century wanted moral empires and biblical frameworks. The 20th century wanted deep psychology, lost civilizations, and space-age wonder. The 21st century wants algorithms, hidden systems, and the thrilling possibility that official history missed something enormous while checking its email. And that is where Enlil and Enki become mirrors as much as myths. Enlil, in modern imagination, can become the face of stern control, cosmic law, or even oppressive authority. Enki can become the clever rebel, the rescuer, the bringer of knowledge, the patron of humanity against harsher powers. What's broadly accepted is that these sharp modern polarizations often simplify the ancient texts, but one interpretation is that the simplification reveals what modern audiences are hungry for. They want the universe to contain identifiable forces. They want wisdom to outmaneuver cold power. They want the hidden current under the floorboards to matter more than the voice from the balcony. And who can blame them? Most people have met a version of Enlil at work and spent years praying for an Enki in the building. A fringe idea proposes that the persistence of these modern readings itself hints that the ancient myths may preserve truths too unsettling for mainstream scholarship to accept. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because distrust of institutions is now part of the emotional environment in which ancient material gets read. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still shows something important. The longing behind the theory is often less about aliens or hidden planets than about wanting the world to be stranger, more meaningful, and less accidental than it appears on a Tuesday afternoon. The mainstream view remains steadier. Archaeology suggests that incomplete texts require disciplined context and caution. The evidence we do have points to a civilization with its own worldview, not a blank screen for modern projections. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Modern projections are inevitable, but they are not the same thing as ancient intent. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the hardest thing to confirm is usually not a planet or a god. It is whether we are hearing the ancient voice or mostly our own echoing back from the ruins. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the pull of Nibiru and the Anunnaki is really the pull of unfinished questions? Who made us? Why does order feel both necessary and cruel? Why does wisdom so often arrive sideways instead of on time? Why do the oldest stories seem to know something about human anxiety that newer stories only decorate? The documented part is that the texts are partial and difficult. The interpreted part is that modern fascination reflects modern longing, as much as ancient content. The imagined part is simple. You stand in a museum gallery at closing time, glass cases, dimming labels too brief for the ache they are trying to summarize, and behind every broken tablet there seems to hover not an answer but an invitation. A popular rumour claims that scholars have deliberately ignored or hidden the most explosive meanings of Mesopotamian material. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is plenty of debate, plenty of disagreement, and plenty of revision in real scholarship without needing a secret vault of forbidden certainty. Scholars continue to debate translation choices, context, chronology, and symbolism, because the material is difficult, not because one hidden truth has been perfectly suppressed for dramatic effect. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it deserves the slower pace. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that ancient Mesopotamian texts are incomplete and often resistant to simple summary. The interpreted part is that modern readers bring their own fears, hopes, and cosmic appetites into the act of reading them. The imagined part is softer still. You trace a crack in an old tablet with your eyes, and it feels as though the missing wedge of clay matters as much as the surviving signs, because absence itself becomes part of the story. And perhaps that is why the whole subject refuses to settle, not because there is one hidden answer beneath everything, but because the distance between us and the first cities is large enough to keep generating wonder. Enlil and Enki remain alive in modern thought, not only because they once stood in temple songs, but because they still organise feelings we have never quite outgrown: authority and cleverness, judgment and rescue, the rule above and the knowledge below. Ancient Mesopotamia gives them names, and modern readers keep leaning toward those names, as if they might still explain something about the long, uneasy business of being human under the stars. And once you notice how much of the modern fascination is really modern longing in ancient costume, the sharpest question of all comes quietly into view. Did Enlil Enki, the Anunnaki and Nibiru, preserve some memory of beings from beyond the earth who created humankind? Or are we standing inside a much older religious and symbolic tradition that later imaginations have dressed in cosmic clothing? Most historians agree that no full scholarly consensus supports the extraterrestrial creation reading. That is the solid ground, and it matters. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian myths belong first to the religious, political, and ecological world of early civilizations, not to a confirmed account of alien intervention. Still, the theory persists, and it persists for reasons worth examining gently rather than scoffing at from a distance. What's broadly accepted is that human creation stories in Mesopotamia use divine labour, clay breath order service, and sacred purpose to explain why people exist within a demanding social world. One interpretation is that later readers, especially in the modern era, reframe these images through technology and science fiction, because those are now the languages that carry awe. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient people say beings shaped humanity from Earth, modern readers hear engineering. When they say the gods came from heaven, modern readers hear space. When they describe cosmic order, modern readers hear advanced systems. That translation may be emotionally understandable, but it's not the same as evidence. Historians still argue whether some of the modern reinterpretations deserve any partial sympathy as creative myth-making, even if they do not hold up as historical claims. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is useful. Because once you stop demanding that the ancient texts either prove aliens or be dismissed as boring, a more interesting middle ground opens up. These stories may not be literal records of extraterrestrial creators, but they do preserve an ancient sense that humanity is made assigned, placed, and watched. They preserve the feeling that life is not random, that intelligence precedes us, that order has a source outside ordinary human control. In that sense, the cosmic reading survives emotionally even when it fails historically. And that emotional survival matters. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were advanced beings from Nibiru who engineered humanity as a labour force, with Enlil and Enki representing rival approaches to human management. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The surviving Mesopotamian texts do not securely support that full framework. There is no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate the meanings of terms divine roles and textual relationships, but the leap from myth to extraterrestrial biotechnology goes well beyond what the tablets can bear. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient material raises possibilities for wonder, not conclusions of that kind. The more cautious explanation is both simpler and stronger. Most historians agree that early civilizations often explain the origins of humans through divine craftsmanship, because craft is one of the most meaningful powers they know. Archaeology suggests that in Mesopotamia, where bricks, tablets, vessels and systems are all made by skilled hands, the image of humanity being made is deeply natural. The evidence we do have points to a world where design is visible everywhere. Fields are designed, canals are designed, cities are designed. So of course the human being too is imagined as designed. You do not need an alien workshop to reach that metaphor. You need a civilization built on shaping materials into function. Enki and Enlil fit beautifully into that symbolic system. Enki, god of wisdom, watercraft and adaptation, naturally aligns with stories in which life is formed, managed and preserved. Enlil, god of decree, order, sacred authority and kingship, naturally aligns with the world into which that life is inserted. One interpretation is that together they express the two great poles of civilization itself, formation and regulation. A more cautious explanation could be that later claims about extraterrestrial creators flourish because these old divine roles are already so grand and distinct that they adapt easily into science fiction categories. Enki becomes the clever genetic designer. Enlil becomes the authoritarian overseer. The old myth survives, but the costumes change. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden planetary biography, but a durable human intuition that life feels both made and managed. The documented part is that Mesopotamian creation myths describe humanity as shaped by divine action for a role within an ordered world. The interpreted part is that modern extraterrestrial readings transform sacred symbolism into technological narrative. The imagined part is softer. You stand between a temple wall warmed by the day's last heat and a canal cooling under moonlight, and for a moment it feels as though the real mystery is not where the gods came from, but why humans across ages keep needing a story in which intelligence existed before them. A popular rumour claims that mainstream scholarship rejects the alien creation theory only because it would overturn too much of accepted history. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, will say so. Scholars reject specific claims mainly when the textual, archaeological and linguistic support is insufficient. That is not a conspiracy. That is just the slow, stubborn pace of evidence doing its job. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm is the dramatic modern superstructure built around Nibiru and engineered humanity. What we can confirm is that ancient Mesopotamians told powerful stories about beings who shaped order, created people, and tied human life to divine purpose. That is not small. In fact, it may be stranger in a quieter way, because the mainstream account leaves you with a world where the first city builders ask enormous questions using the materials available to them: clay, floodwater, kingship stars, labour law, and longing. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that no scholarly consensus supports extraterrestrial creation as the historical meaning of these texts. The interpreted part is that the myths remain open enough to inspire modern cosmic readings. The imagined part is the sensation of looking up from the oldest bricks and feeling that whoever first asked where humans came from was already reaching beyond the horizon, even if the answer they shaped came back wearing a horned crown instead of a helmet. And perhaps that is where the careful line should rest. Not on ridicule, not on certainty, but on proportion. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground says Enlil Enki, the Anunnaki, and Nibiru belong first to a rich Mesopotamian religious world. The mist says modern readers keep seeing something more because the old stories still crackle with unresolved scale. That's a possibility, not a certainty. but it may be enough. Sometimes the power of a myth is not that it hands you the answer, but that it teaches you how long a good question can survive. And after all the temple smoke, floodwater, copied tablets, debated planets, and modern speculation, you come back to the quietest truth of the whole journey. Enlil Enki, the Anunnaki, and even the elusive word Nibiru belong first to the world of ancient Mesopotamia, to the religious imagination of people living between dangerous rivers and under an enormous sky. Most historians agree that these figures are part of a richly layered, mythic tradition, shaped by early cities, temple economies, sacred kingship, environmental uncertainty, and the patient labour of scribes who pressed memory into clay. That is the solid ground. Archaeology suggests that if you want to understand these gods fairly, you begin not with hidden planets, but with mud brick canals, ritual, and the practical fragility of life in Sumer. And yet the mystery does not vanish when you say that. It simply changes shape. What's broadly accepted is that Enlil stands close to authority, order, decree, and the sacred weight behind kingship, while Enki stands close to watercraft, wisdom, and the subtle intelligence that keeps life from unravelling. One interpretation is that their endurance comes from how well they express a tension that civilizations never solve completely. You need structure, but structure can become harsh. You need flexibility, but flexibility can become chaos. You need law, and you need cunning. You need the high voice that sets limits, and the deep voice that knows where mercy fits. A careful reading might suggest that these gods last in human memory because they still describe forces you can feel in ordinary life, even when no temple stands nearby. Historians still argue whether the oldest layers of these traditions can ever be fully recovered from the later copies, translations, and adaptations that preserve them. There's no full consensus, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But the evidence we do have points to something remarkable enough. The first great city builders left behind stories in which the world is made meaningful through divine character. Creation is not random. Labour is not random. Kingship is not random. Flood and rescue are not random. Everything is tied into a sacred pattern, even if that pattern is sometimes severe, sometimes merciful, and often just mysterious enough to keep later generations awake far past bedtime. A fringe idea proposes that all of this preserves a hidden history of beings from Nibiru who shaped humankind directly. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the old stories do leave room for wonder. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the appeal becomes easier to understand. Modern people are hungry for origins that feel grand, strange, and emotionally satisfying. But a more cautious explanation could be that the true power of these myths is not that they secretly describe extraterrestrials. It is that they describe with unsettling elegance what it feels like to live in a world governed by forces larger than yourself. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest legacy of Enlil and Enki is not a hidden planet, but a human habit of thinking in pairs whenever life becomes difficult to explain? Authority and wisdom, judgment and rescue, sky and water, command and craft. The documented part is that these gods belong to Mesopotamian religion and literature. The interpreted part is that their lasting pull comes from how powerfully they embody the structure and strain of civilization itself. The imagined part is softer. Evening settles over the river plain, the last of the heat lifts from the temple walls, and the old names seem to remain not as answers, but as shapes the mind still reaches for when it wants to understand who made the world feel this ordered, this fragile, and this strange. Now the pace begins to soften. You let the questions rest where they are. The canals darken into steel ribbons beneath the night. The reeds move with a small dry whisper. Far off a lamp burns in some quiet room where a scribe bends over clay, pressing signs that may outlive cities' dynasties and every confident theory that comes later. The stars above Mesopotamia remain exactly where they have always been, bright enough to invite wonder, distant enough to refuse easy answers. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And that is all right now. You do not need to solve Nibiru before sleep comes. You do not need to settle every debate about Enlil and Enki tonight. You only need to let the old world grow quiet around you. The mud brick walls hold the day's last warmth. The water keeps its patient silence. The sky stretches on deep and dark, with no hurry in it at all. Somewhere in that vastness, ancient people once looked up and asked where order came from, where wisdom lived, and why human beings were placed between flood and field law and mercy work and wonder. Those questions drift onward. The city dims, the tablets cool. The gods grow still in the mind, not gone, just distant now, like voices carried away across water. And as the night settles over the first cities, you can let the mystery remain, a mystery gentle and unfinished, while sleep comes in quietly like a reed boat, easing onto calm black water beneath the stars.